I fell asleep standing up fishing. And at that point, I said, guys, I'm done.
Time for the Angler Within podcast with Roy Bilby.
How is everything, JD?
That is a loaded question. Roy.
Yeah,
But doing
I
okay.
realize.
It's been a little while. And thank you so much to all of you out there for your patience while we've been getting this all together. I'll go ahead and full disclosure. I lost my mother 2 weeks ago. So I was out taking care of that. And Roy and I had pre-recorded a couple of episodes. And thanks to technology, we lost one of them. And then we
Yeah.
put another one up. But this all works out better because you're getting the most up-to-date version of us, right?
Right. We're more current than we've ever been with what we're talking about and discussing. So
Exactly.
much better in that regard.
So there it is. Good to see you finally, Mr. Bilby.
Likewise. So you've been putting our email out there week after week.
We have one from, I think it's one of your devoted followers. This is an
Okay.
email from Michael. It says, "Good afternoon, Roy. I have been listening to your podcast and really enjoying it."
Awesome. Thanks, Mike.
Good to hear. Thank you so much, Mike. Something I would love to learn from your podcast is a more in-depth look at how the moon phases affect bass fishing. That is an area of fishing I have never looked at. So what great timing that is. He actually sent that last month, but we're now able to talk about moon phase because we're in the middle of a full moon phase right now. We got a full moon coming up in a couple days.
Yeah, we're coming up on one. We just came out of the first quarter, and I think within 3 days of the full moon. So I can talk about that. We should talk about that this episode, as a matter of fact. And another thing I want to touch on is because we talked about the lunar eclipse that was so incredibly productive for me way back. Good grief, must have been in the 80s. And I vowed to fish the next one. And I didn't know about it until this one we had this past March 24th. And I was fishing the tank at Bass Pro Shops in Auburn, New York. And no discernible difference. But because that's not really fishing. But although it was the lunar eclipse, it didn't affect the fish in the tank inside the store at all. They hit the same way they always do. But I vowed to fish the upcoming solar eclipse because we were right on the edge of the path of totality. We were like 3% in my area where I live, and I vowed to fish that. And same lake that I fished that lunar eclipse way back in the 80s, just to see. And I've got a whole story about that. So I want to talk about that in this episode. How about you said we had a couple?
There was another one. Your son had written us a letter.
Oh, really?
Yes. So
this ought to be good.
his subject is first-time boat owner.
Yeah, he just bought his first boat and trailer. Super excited.
Awesome. So here's his email. Just
Okay.
bought my first boat, a small aluminum John boat. What are 5 essential pieces of gear that I need to be successful? Let's make this interesting. The list cannot include tackle, motor, or oars, anchor, electronics, and seats. He says, I'm looking for 5 things in Roy's boat that he uses and are unique to his success. Loving the podcast so far. Keep it going.
Thank you. Appreciate that. But that is textbook. My son, there always has to be restriction. He tied my hands here and he listed pretty much everything that was on the tip of my tongue to put out there. So let's talk. He put me on the spot here. The thing that's really made me successful is what I call my day box. That's got it. It's a small plastic tote that I carry my voice recorder, my digital fish counters, my surface temperature gauge, the little portable one I made, a hook hone, a camera, binoculars, needle nose players, all my little gadgets and tools to record all my information from that day. But that's because I keep a journal. So let's turn this around and say just in general equipment you should have in a boat. All right, so he didn't mention this. You got to have a personal flotation device. I don't care what state you live in. You got to have that to be legal. So that's number 1. They should be in the boat. You have to have a way of signaling other boats or lock gates to open. You have to have a horn. And most both my bass boats have horns, but prior to having a horn in a boat, I just bought for $10 at a Kmart or Walmart. You can buy one of those little blister pack air horns. And I still have one in my tournament boat as a backup should my regular horn fail. And I'll tell you this, the horns they have on boats are not loud at all. That little air horn is 4 times the volume of whatever you have on your little console switch. So that's number 2. Spend $10, get an air horn. Here's the big one. Spare prop and prop wrench. And this goes to bass boats, but I know he's going to have an outboard on his. If you're making a decent run and you clip a rock and throw a blade, you're in trouble. You're relying on that trolling motor to get you all the way back. So both my bass boats, I have a spare prop in a case and a prop wrench stored in the storage. So if I have any kind of an issue with the prop, I can replace it and get up and running. Learned that the hard way. Matter of fact, my son was with me on Saratoga Lake when I had my very first nitro and had an aluminum prop, but there was metal fatigue, and we're running down the lake and we just started experiencing this vibration. So I shut down and said, what in the world is wrong? Trimmed the motor up, and I only had 2 blades on the prop. I went, well, I know I can't run now because the vibration is going to blow the seals. Thank goodness it was so prominent when it started. I shut down immediately, and we got towed back by a guy in what I call I had a derogatory, I call them ride arounds. Anything that's not a fishing boat is a ride around. But that guy threw us a rope and towed us the length of the lake all the way back to the state launch. He slowed down till we drifted in so I could hand him the rope back, and went to give him $20, and he smiled and waved and took off and said, have a nice day. So spare prop and prop wrench, number 3. Number 4, a tow rope. You never know. And not just for you, you might be in a position that that gentleman was to save somebody else from having a horrible bad day. Okay, number 5, jump pack. My trolling motors are 24 volt, 2 batteries in series. I've never jumped my start battery off of one of those, but I believe to do it, you got to unhook everything or you're putting 24 volts into a 12-volt battery. So I carry a jump pack. So there's 5 essential things to have in your boat at all times to make sure that you don't have a disaster when you're out there on the lake. Good question, but came with exclusions as per usual, so he had to make it a challenge for me. But I appreciate that, and hope that list of 5 essentials helps anybody who's a first-time boat buyer like my son. It's awesome. So we want to dive right into the moon phase?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I kept track of moon phase because I knew it was a piece of the puzzle and a critical piece a lot of the time. One of the most important essential times that moon phase is crucial for bass in particular is when they spawn. Largemouth and smallmouth spawn at different temperatures. Smallmouth will spawn sooner because I haven't looked at it in a long time, but I believe their preferred temperature for spawning is like 58 to 64 degrees, somewhere in that range, where for largemouth, it's like 68 to 74 when they spawn. Here's the deal. I'm guessing at those because it's been a long time since I looked at, but I believe it's within those parameters. Here's the deal. When the water temperature is approaching that and we come into a moon phase, it doesn't matter if it's cloudy or overcast. When we come into a full moon, if the water temperature has been in that proper range for them and we're coming up on the full moon phase, and we get a cold front that drops that water temperature 4 degrees, and it drops right out of that preferred range, they will not spawn. They will wait in 2 weeks until the new moon, and if the water temperature is correct at that point, then they will spawn. If it's not, they'll wait for the next full moon. So that's how crucial moon phase is in their life cycle in regards to spawning specifically. The rest of the year, it does play as a role, as I mentioned on a previous podcast. If you look at the top 25 bass weight wise of all time, a majority of those fish were caught either 3 days prior or 3 days immediately following that full moon phase. It's a trigger for those big fish to feed. And if you get one of the outdoor magazines that has a salooner tables in it, pay attention to those if you're going to fish around the full moon phase, because it will tell you the major and minor feeding times. And I cannot tell you how many times we've had a day when we're fishing when, I mean, the switch, that proverbial switch goes on, and it is just a slam fest, cast after cast after cast, and until it's over. And I run home and I check, and more often than not, it is right in that major feeding time that they list. So it's pretty cool. The biggest largemouth I've caught in New York, I checked, and it was right in that slot of that major feeding time. It's usually a 2-hour block. There's a major and minor listed for every day, and they change every day by 20 or 30 minutes. So, and that's all in relation to moon phase. I spent 3 years, I'm thinking in the mid 90s it was. There was a 3-year period when I hit every full moon from May until October, and I think 2 of those years we went as far as November. We were always out with a full moon, either, 2, 3 days either side of that full moon phase. I did it for 3 years consecutively, every full moon, spring through fall, late fall, and we had some unbelievable nights. And just to illustrate how committed I was to this, 1994, we took a family trip up to Canada. My dad was still working, and he was a mason contractor. He had a guy that he knew that lived in our area, but this gentleman had a camp up in Canada, and he hired my dad 4 years in a row. One year they jacked up the camp and rebuilt the foundation and then set the camp back down. Another year, my dad went up and installed indoor plumbing for the guy, which was because he had an outhouse. This was a remote camp. It was about 17 miles from any paved road. And the third year, he built the guy a fireplace in the cabin because that's what he did. And I think the fourth year he redid the guy's kitchen for him. And so this guy's name was Dave Boynton, and my dad, knowing how addicted I was to the fishing, said, you've got to come up here and experience this, because Dave, bless his heart, knew my dad and his workaholic work ethic, and he would buy him a fishing license and insist that the first day there he would fish all day, and then they would work for the remaining 6 days, because he knew my dad would get the work done and leave without staying to fish. So he always made him fish for one day, and they had fantastic trips. I think my son was 9 years old when we went to Canada. That's why I believe it was 1994, because he was 9 years old that year. And we went up there, and I had an aluminum bass tracker, my first bass boat, Bass Tracker Pro 17. Ran that boat for 7 years, hauled it all the way up to Canada. I was up every morning at 4:30, on the water at 5, fished for 4.5 hours, came back at 9:30 while everybody was getting breakfast. And then I did the same thing in the evening. And it was an amazing experience. But the point I'm getting to is the day that we left that camp to come back home, and it was 10 hours from my driveway to that camp, 10 hours straight driving. We got up at 6 in the morning and we left at 8 o'clock. I pulled in my driveway 6 p.m. that night, unloaded my truck, from all our clothing and suitcases and stuff for the trip, but I left my fishing gear in the truck and the boat hooked up because it happened to be the night of the full moon, and I called two of my fishing buddies and said, "It's the full moon tonight. My boat's hooked up. You interested?" They're like, "Yep." And we went to a lake, 2,000 surface acre lake that was just, oh my goodness, we had a night. We just hit the walleye like crazy. Caught some smallmouth, caught some largemouth, but that full moon, it had those fish crank. And then we hit a lull about 4 o'clock in the morning. Now, mind you, I'd been up since 6 a.m. the previous morning, had driven 10 hours from Canada to the US, went through customs, all that stuff, and then drove an hour to this lake, never went to sleep, and fished through the night. 4 a.m. the next morning, it slowed right down, yet we were still fishing at 9 o'clock. And we had another surge, and the bite turned right on. And we caught him good for a while, but I distinctly remember it was on 11 o'clock in the morning. I was standing on the front deck. I had a pedestal with a bicycle seat on it. We always called them a butt seat. So you're standing, but you're leaning against it. And I fell asleep standing up 11 o'clock that morning because the rod fell out of my hands. That's what woke me up. I fell asleep standing up fishing. And at that point, I said, "Guys, I'm done. I haven't slept for 2 days, and I need to get home safely and get to bed." And, so that's what we did. That's how dedicated I was to that 3-year period where I hit every full moon. So, to answer Mike's question, it really does have an influence and sometimes a very dominating influence. They will not spawn without that that moon phase. And many times, if you're gonna go out and experiment yourself, go out when we have the full moon, but get an outdoor magazine that has those solunar tables in it and consult those. And if you're able to, go with the peak times. Go make sure you're there an hour before that peak period starts and an hour after, and just see if it coincides with your results. I'm betting it will, because more often than not it does. So moon phase absolutely has a positive influence. I've never known it to have a negative influence. And here's the thing. We even tried a couple new moons during that 3-year period. Now that's when there's no light in the sky and it's pitch black. But most of these lakes, there we got to know this one lake really good across that 3 years. This guy must have worked second shift. He was on a camp on the lower southeast end of the lake, and I mean, that purple green glow from his television was in that basement window every night we fished until about 2 o'clock in the morning, at which time it went off. So it's not like he fell asleep watching it. It always went off at 2 o'clock. So that must have been a second shift guy. It was always my guess. But the new moon were interesting because the camps that had their lights on gave you a little bit of a guide, but you would be surprised how well your eyes adjust to that total darkness. You can see. We never used a black light, but when you're making a cast, you have to know where you are because you're listening for that bait to land in the water. And if you're too close to the bank and you don't hear a splash, you have no idea what you landed in. And if you're using a top water, we heard blow up strikes without feeling it. So if they missed our lure, if you swing, you got treble hooks flying back at you in the dark. So you've got to be careful when you fish the new moon. But it's amazing. I could not believe how our eyes adjusted to no light whatsoever, and we could actually see and make out things. But here's a little tip. If you catch a big fish doing that and you take a picture, when that flash goes off, you can't see squat for the next 3 minutes. It's all spots.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It's like a lightning flash that pierces that pitch black, and now your eyes are shot for about 3 minutes. It was an amazing experience to do all that. We had a lot of success. There was only 1 or 2 of those nights when we really, really didn't hit them. More often than not, we did. If you're there on the waxing moon, which is on the side where it's rising to the full moon. The waning is like the 3 days after the actual full moon. It's a waxing and waning. So if
Gibbons.
it
It's waxing and waning Gibbons. That's what it says on my weather app all the time. Waxing Gibbons.
Yeah, right. The waxing moon is the 3 days leading up to the full moon, and that was my favorite period because the moon is actually rising as the sun is setting, and you never lose your light. If it's a clear night, you never lose your light, and your eyes just adjust accordingly. But although it was my favorite nights to fish the full moon because you never really truly lost light. There was never a period of darkness until later when the moon set. Then it was dark. But it usually took a while for the bite to kick in. It was usually later at night, like 10, 11 o'clock. So, but the waxing moon was my favorite just because you never fished in darkness unless you stayed until the wee hours and the moon set, and now you got to find your way back to the launch and no headlights on a bass boat. I want to talk about this solar eclipse because my experience was incredible with it. I returned to the same lake where we had that incredible day with the lunar eclipse way back in the 80s. Now, this lake is about 8 minutes from my house. It's still got a lot of smallmouth in it, a lot of perch. There's bullhead, there's some crappie in there. And it's maybe 50 acres. It's not a big lake, but I know every inch of it. And I've got my spots. Now, this eclipse, I was there about, I think, an hour before it was supposed to start. And just so everybody knows, I fished this lake 1 week prior to the solar eclipse just to get a feel for what was going on with the lake. And I fished it 3 hours, the same time frame that I fished during the eclipse. And the week prior to the eclipse, conditions were pretty much the same other than having a solar eclipse. But that day I caught a grand total of 15 fish. I caught 3 smallmouth and a dozen perch on bass baits and that little 2-inch squirming shad that I throw so much. And that was an average day for this time of year. That is not what I experienced during the eclipse. I was there, like I said, an hour prior to, and my day started out pretty much a carbon copy of the day I fished a week prior. It was slow and steady. It was, I mean, even on my first best spot, I picked up two smallmouth and one perch. But it was inconsistent. I maybe fished that stretch for 20, 25 minutes and only picked up those three. And that's usually loaded with fish. And I said, well, it may be a slow day, but the interesting thing that happened, and going through my really, really good areas, I'd pick up one here, one there. That was about it. Going through the mediocre areas, it was barren water, which you expect. Those are areas where you typically would get one here, one there, which is what the good areas were only producing at the start. When the eclipse started, once it started to come, you could see it coming into that sun with the glasses. I was in one of the mediocre areas and I went 7 consecutive casts without hooking a fish. Then I missed one, and then I went 4 more consecutive casts. It's like a switch flip. And I was in one of the mediocre areas. It's not supposed to be that good, but as that eclipse was occurring, it flipped a switch and it was crazy. I could cast anywhere and get bit. That was not the day I was having prior to that eclipse starting. It was just business as usual. And when that eclipse started, about 10 minutes into it, when it was definitely getting into the sun, it triggered a bite that was just so good and not typical of the day I had had up to that point.
Did it mimic what it would do if it was dusk? Essentially, did you see a change in what it would be if the sun had gone down? Was it that kind of a change, or was it a
Sometimes as the sun sets, it'll trigger a bite, but that's a hit or miss thing. The weird thing about the eclipse was we had a lot of cloud cover in our area. So even though the sun was getting covered, it was reflecting in the water vapor in the clouds. So it never got really dark, dark, dark. It got like early evening. It never got to be like dusk like you would think,
Right.
just because we had so much cloud cover. Sometimes it was hard to see through all the clouds. We could see it good enough to know what was going on, and you could absolutely tell as it was coming into that sun and blocking out. Is really really cool, and things got quiet. I mean, there was as it came into almost complete coverage to where it was just like a little, I call it a toenail moon. It's a crescent moon, but you just had that little sliver. At that point, that bite shut off. I mean, it was dead. And at that point, I had gotten to one of my absolute best stretches, probably one of my top 3 areas on the lake where they're always lined up, stacked up, taking their turns at your bait. And it was absolutely flat dead. The water was slick, calm, and we'd had a breeze before that, but it wasn't as dark as I thought it would be. It was like early evening because of the reflection of the sunlight with all the clouds. And so it never really got dark where I was, but the water got dead still. There was no breeze and it got eerily quiet. It was like an eerie silence. No birds, no ambient noise whatsoever, save for the cars going by on the road. It was eerie. I'm like, I wrote in my journal, I made notes in my voice recorder, said, holy cow, everything just stopped and it is still. Just a weird, eerie feeling. And then once the sun started to get exposed again, the bite kinda it started to come back, but it didn't really pick up. It never got to where it was cast after cast after cast like it was when the eclipse started. I mean, that first 30 minutes of that eclipse were just it was crazy. I could do no wrong. Now I was getting one here, one there, and that was in my one of my top 3 right adjacent to the area I fished when it was fully covered is another area that it's a flat with a rock wall and rocks on the shoreline. And that's probably my second best area, probably my best area on the entire lake for consistent bites with the smallmouth. And just because of the time of year, there's a lot of perch in there with them feeding on the same stuff. And I would catch one or two, picked up a couple more, and then the remaining 45 minutes of my day while the sun was getting more and more and more exposed. In that last 45 minutes, I picked up one more fish.
Hmm.
I thought it was odd that it shut off like a switch, especially in one of my primo areas on this lake when the sun was fully covered. And as it started to get exposed again, I thought, well, here we go again. And that is not what happened. But that first half hour as the coverage came on, it was absolutely undeniable. For lack of a better term, a lights out experience where every cast you were getting belted. And like I said, a week prior, I fished all the same spots and had 15 fish, 3 smallmouth, 12 perch. During the 3 hours that I fished the eclipse, the same time frame as a week prior, I caught 36 fish, more than twice as many. And I had 25 perch and 11 smallmouth. But they hit hard and consistently during that eclipse. Now, full disclosure here, I had 2 friends that I fished with who both committed themselves to being on the water for this eclipse. And those are not the results that they had. Not not even close. One guy went to a lake where we'd been fishing for the perch and doing extremely well, and he fished into the eclipse. I think he spent 3 hours on that lake, and he had one hookup that lasted about 3 seconds. He never caught a fish.
Huh.
So he went to another lake. He got disgusted, left, loaded up, went to another lake, which is relatively close. It took him about 15 minutes to get there. It's a lake where he booked 180 fish on that lake in numerous trips last year, and he caught, I think he said 11 total fish. And that is not what that lake does. That lake is usually you're going to catch 30, 40 fish. And he struggled to catch 11, I think. The other guy went to a local body of water, fished during the eclipse, and caught 2 fish. He said they just weren't biting. And that is not the experience I had. So I'd be interested in hearing from many of our listeners, having them email us that if they fished the eclipse, what were your results? You know what mine were. And for me, it was an undeniable positive effect. I was stoked that happened, that they turned on and fired so consistently for that first 30 minutes as the sun was getting covered. It was cool, and it was undeniable. It was not the day I was having until that happened, and then it was like a different day. I could do no wrong. It was gangbuster. It was crazy good for that 30 minutes. So I'd be real interested in hearing from many of our listeners and sharing their experience during the eclipse. See if anybody else experienced what I did, because I know my 2 buddies that fished here locally gave me their reports, and that is not the result that they had. There it is. We got to wait 20 years to fish another one, but
You have a full moon coming up though in a few days, so you can
yeah.
keep moon phasing, Roy
Yeah.
and Mike. Moon phase it up.
Yeah, let's do that. I'll be on the water tomorrow and the next day as we come into that full moon phase, and I'm anticipating good results. I am. I've seen it too much. I know it has a positive effect, but there's other factors at work too. I mean, if it's a full moon and you got a cold front blowing in with wind out of the east and chilly temperatures, your prevailing weather conditions can supersede any of the other factors.
Yeah, but we
I
got a
mean,
westerly wind this weekend, so we're gonna be okay.
wind from the west, fish bite best.
Is that a saying?
Well, there's a saying, fish from the north, fishermen go forth. Wind from the south, hook 'em in the mouth. Wind from the west, fish bite best. Wind from the east, fish bite the least. And I say if it's west, northwest, just go catch them.
Wow.
And I have had some horrible days on an east wind. And I've gone out to prove that theory wrong, but I've had some horrible days on an east. Well, there's a reason for that saying. In our area, the prevailing winds come from the west, and everything is used to that. So when you get an east wind, it flip-flops the norm,
Mm-hmm.
and fish have to adjust to that. And that's kind of my theory on why the east wind does that. All across the US, prevailing winds come out of the north and west,
Right.
typically out of the west. When it comes from the north, it gets cold. When it comes from the south, things warm up. When it comes from the east, we get the bad storms. It flip-flops everything that is the norm. Everything has to adjust, and I think that's why the east wind does that.
And if it
That's
comes from the south, hook them in the mouth.
giddy up.
I'm going to remember these. All right. Does that do it for our moon phase conversation and eclipse?
That's everything that I wanted to cover. I wanted to share my experiences, but I really am interested in hearing from anybody that may have fished during that and see if their experience mirrored mine or my 2 buddies that just had polar opposite results from what I did.
Right. Well, you heard the man. Give us an email, anglerwithinpodcast@gmail.com. And of course, check out Roy's Instagram page at RoyBillB. And thank you always for listening. And Roy, nice to finally catch up with you and get everybody up to speed.
I pray for you and your family, and I'm sorry for the loss of your mom. I know she's in a better place. I know what she was going through and what you were going through with her. So always know that your family is in my thoughts and prayers, and I would encourage our listeners to do the same. And now that we're back on schedule, we will do our best to help you tap into your angler within.